Hey everybody, this week we're going to be getting into the bark drawings assignment. And in order to do this assignment, you're going to have to go outside, look at some trees, and just take some photos of the bark with your phone. That's the first part. When we get into drawing, you're going to see in the video coming up, we go through sketching, how to sketch the initial big value shapes, and working general to specific, big shapes to small shapes, big things to smaller details. And then you're going to make 3 different rectangles on your sketchbook, and you're going to do 3 different drawings of 3 different types of bark. So things to remember: just sketch really lightly when you're starting off, and then also we're going to cover a little bit about how are you going to hatch this, because we're going to be using pen and ink, we're going to be using our dip pens, and we're also going to be using our liners. So we're going to learn how to use a dip pen, and we're going to learn how to also use our liner. All this and more coming up as we get into this this lesson. It's a fun one because bark is really a bunch of abstract shapes. You know, in the last lesson we were also looking at a bunch of abstract shapes bumping into each other with the crumpled up piece of paper. So with bark, again, we are given a bunch of abstract shapes that we're going to have to discern and just not think about, oh, this is bark, or oh, this is an eye, these types of symbols, but really looking at what we're seeing, what are the different values, and yeah, so let's get into it. This week we're going to be working on bark drawings. And those are exactly what they sound like. The first part of this assignment is go outside and take some pictures of tree bark. After you've done that, you're going to make 3 squares on your paper. I'm going to make mine 3 inches by 4 inches. 3 inches wide by 4 inches tall. Now the next thing we're going to do, we've got our squares here. We're going to sketch lightly with, you know, a harder pencil, like a 2H, for instance. And remember, since this is harder, we really don't want to destroy the tooth of our paper, because we want to be able to erase this pencil later. So this is just a preliminary sketch, and really play around with drawing extremely light. So now that I've got some different photos on my phone, I just went outside and took some pictures of different types of tree bark that you can see here. This one's pretty trippy. And now that I've got these different photos to work from, I'm just going to put my phone right next to my square itself. And I'm going to sketch in these big value shapes. So you imagine this value shape right here. Let's say, or let's start with this one. This one goes about that far in. So I'm going to go about that same distance in. And I'm just very lightly and loosely, you can see how far away I'm holding the pencil from the image as well. It's obviously better to have this on the left side, but for this demonstration, I'm just showing you this way. So you're just sketching in these big value shapes. And so that's a basic sketch of that kind of pointy looking thing right there. And, you know, if you're sketching really lightly, it's really easy to erase as well. So the first part of this is you're just going to be sketching in these big value shapes that you see in your photo. And don't worry too much. Even a good thing to do can be to switch these photos to black and white as well, so you don't even have to think about color. in any way. There is some color, you know, some bluish in this gray as well. So change them to black and white. That can help out as well. And you're just starting by sketching in these big value shapes that you see. We're going to do that with 3 of your images in these 3 squares. Now let's meet the different tools that we'll be using for this assignment. The first thing is for sketching, just a harder 2H pencil. And then we're going to really get into using our dip pens a lot more. So let's take a look at this pen really quick. On this pen you can see this part here is called the nib, and then this is just called the holder. This is a Tachikawa holder, and the nib I have in it is a Browse Steno number 361. And I have found that to just be a really good nib for the way that I draw. Both of these things I just got on Amazon, actually. So the way that this nib works is it's got a well that holds the ink here, and then this little hole here allows, you know, air to pass through, and it goes down these 2 things here, and those are called tines, kind of like tines on a pitchfork or something like that. And when you push on the paper, those 2 tines open up very, very slightly. And so when you open up those 2 tines, it allows the ink to flow down onto your paper. So you can see you're holding the ink in this thing, and you're kind of letting it dribble out onto the paper very slowly. The type of ink that we're using is India ink. And India ink is made from soot, actually. And I'm sure there's some process they've refined over the years, but it creates, basically soot is, you know, what's in chimneys from, you know, burning stuff, and they just mix it with water. There's actually no other binder in this but water. So it's basically just water and soot. Soot's also called lamp black. Here's another type, Speedball Super Black India ink. This stuff is quite good as well. And the other thing we're going to need is a liner. And this is a AIT Art Mini Liner. I got this off Amazon as well. A 3-0 brush. And the main thing is, if you can, if possible, you don't want to get the ink up towards the end. That's what causes your brush to splay. So if possible, you want to just get the ink, you know, up to like that point on the brush, 3/4 of the way up. Same with your nib. You don't want to dip your nib all the way up into here. Just dip your nib to this point here. You can even see that little groove there. And the first thing that we're going to do is just play around with some different marks. And this can be really free and really open. And we're going to be just getting used to the different marks that we can make. And inking requires a lot of concentration. And ink is also not very forgiving. It's pretty hard to erase it, isn't it? So let's start off with taking our liner brush. I've got my ink right here. The one thing you also want to be careful with, every semester in my class when it was in real life, somebody would spill their ink on the desk, and that's just because they're dipping and they're kind of not looking, and then they pull their brush back, and a lot of times they'll spill onto their page as well. And so just be careful when you're pulling your brush out of your ink that you're not going to spill it. So I've got my brush here, and let's just start off with some parallel lines. Just feel how this feels. You got to get used to how much ink this thing holds. We'll just start with doing some parallel lines. At first you can see these two lines, it wasn't taking all the ink. I needed to dip it twice. So you do have to kind of pay attention to how dry this thing is getting. And you can also use that dryness to your benefit as well. Now let's try some larger marks. See if we push it a little bit sideways, we can get a fat mark and a small mark. Let's play around with some of these. Now this thing offers a lot of what we call line variation. And line variation is really important in drawing because the more varied our line is, the more pleasing to the eye it is. That's why lines from our Sharpie compared to this line right? So just this slight more variation feels very, very different immediately. And these types of brushes and these type of dip pens, their main bonus is that they give us more line variation. So you can literally be drawing the same exact thing. If you use a dip pen, it's going to look more interesting just because it's going to have better line variation. Still just playing around with different marks. Let's do some lines, thick and thin. So we're just getting a feel for our brush, just playing around with it, seeing how it works. And you can see some angles don't work as well. You know, this angle seems to be working well. Feel how it's going. Obviously going this way, it's not gonna, this angle in this direction is gonna jam up our bristles, and we really wanna make sure this point is kept to a fine point. It's also good to always have water here, and occasionally just rinse off your brush and then dab it, you know, clean it off with the tissue and then bring that point back. And so that's important. Just maintain your brush as you go. Let's just try some little dots. So these are all just different types of techniques we want to get used to a little bit before we get into our bark drawings. And we could even try little circles. Just getting a feel for the pressure needed to make these drawings. Now, a good exercise to do once you've got comfortable with just making some different marks, making some different thicknesses of line, is try to put multiple lines together and play around with that thickness and thinness. Go like this, and then on the outside of this one, make another instance of the same thing. And you can kind of see how this naturally becomes like braids. Right, so play around with those kind of lines. And then the last one is to make our friend the value scale again. And we got to think about when we're hatching, think about these 4 different marks that we can make. 45 degrees to the right, 45 degrees to the left, vertical and horizontal. This is a really simple way to make a value scale. Now for this one, we're going to use all 4 of these marks. We're going to do 45. We've done that one. Let's do the next one. Good. After that, we do the next one, which is the vertical lines. And the final one, the horizontal lines. This one, we simply use one less. This one we use one less as well. And then this one, we just have the one direction. And it's a really simple way. So this one has all of those lines. This one has those. This one has those. And like that. And it's a really simple way to just get used to hatching and also thinking about, okay, if I can make a value scale, I can hatch it in pretty much any way. There is one problem, and that is the idea of direction. And the direction of these lines is going to indicate something about the form underneath it. So let's say I've got a cube like this. If I shade in that same, I know this plane is going in that direction, you know? This plane here, it doesn't feel like it's going that way. It feels like it's going down. So when I shade this plane of this cube here, if I shade that direction, it reinforces the form underneath it. Does that make sense? It's reinforcing that sense of form underneath the structure. The direction of the mark for my hatching is also going in that direction. So since this is going back in space, right, I'm going to just keep that direction as well for my shading and my hatching there. Then for that side, I could keep it like that. And I can show you an example. Say we had a different cube. Now watch how this feels different if I See how that shading makes that square, that cube, it doesn't feel like it's in the right space because the shading is going the wrong direction. Now it feels totally difficult to understand. So think about the direction of your object itself. You know, if it's more circular, of course it's going to feel more circular. And this is true. Let's see if I've got any money. Yeah, I do. Of course, it's true with money as well. You can look at the hatching present here. The hatching itself is following that form, and it's giving us some information about the underlying form underneath it. Okay, so think about the direction of your marks. At first, it's going to be a little bit wonky, and it's going to be difficult because which way does a nose go, right? Like which way does the side of your nose go, or which way underneath your lips? So you're going to be dealing with all these different directions that don't make quite as much sense as that square. But it's something just to pay attention to as you're starting out with ink. Now the second thing that we've got is this dip pen here. And like I said, you want to dip it about 3/4 of the way down. And this pen, wow, I have less ink in here than I thought. Let's do a little refill. And now with this pen, you can see we're also able to get some line variation with it just by pressure, less pressure, more pressure. And look at, we can get a lot of line variation just out of this simple pen as well. So we start off . Another thing that happens with these types of brushes, or these types of pens and these types of marks, is you start dealing with what's called line weight as well. So the weight of a line, again, this is a difficult concept to kind of get your head around, but it's kind of using gravity as a guide. So this line is thicker down here. It feels thicker. It feels like it's pulling down a little bit more than this skinny area at the top. And this is another thing, just pay attention to it. It's something that comes with, you know, miles. People talk about miles in art all the time. And what do miles mean? They basically mean just practice, right? Just practicing this stuff all the time. So we can see it feels like this line being a little bit thicker at the bottom, it makes it feel like it's pulling down. And this is present in drawings all over the place. Pencil drawings as well. And we just do that by varying the pressure. Now you can see I'm not going up the same way with my brush. I'm not trying to draw this direction, right? That's going to cause my tines to get stuck like they just did on the paper. You want to draw, let those tines open up. You can go all different directions, but you just can't go up. So work down and work and figure out how you want to work with this pen. So a good thing to do with this is make up some just imaginary shapes with some overlaps and different line variation. Play around with making some different variations with your line. These can just be abstract blobs. They don't need to be anything too serious. Play around and make a couple blobby shapes. And you can go inside your blobby shape and make some more. All right, play around with those, make some blobs, and then you're gonna do the same thing. Make a value scale. Obviously, you got to be careful with your hand because this does stay wet. So same as this. This has all those marks. Okay, so I hope you've got some basic practice, and this is all about just play around with this pen until it feels comfortable. It'll take a little bit of time, but once you get it, it'll make sense. So play around with it, get used to it, and then we'll move on to using it in our bark drawings. All right, so let's review what we did today. First thing is go outside, take some photos. Then you're gonna draw your rectangles. I did mine 3 by 4 inches. After that, you're gonna start off by sketching lightly with your pencil of the bark drawing. And then we also learned quite a bit about crosshatching as well, and just, you know, what crosshatching means. And the main things we learned was you can crosshatch in different shapes, right? So you can crosshatch and actually create shapes with your crosshatching. Instead of drawing, you know, this shape, we can actually make that with our hatching itself. We also learned that the direction that we crosshatch is also important. So we should try to crosshatch with the same direction of our object itself. We also learned about line variation and why these dip pens give us these nicer varied lines than something like a Sharpie, right? And of course, we also learned about line weight, and that's the idea that, of course, lines get heavier and thicker at certain areas, and we can use that to kind of emphasize what is happening to that shape or to that form. So I hope everybody gets into these bark drawings. They're really fun, and they're another drawing you can just keep on pushing and pushing and pushing, because these things are never-endingly complicated, but they kind of work like fractals. So the big shapes are present within these small shapes. So think again about general to specific. Those things still apply in these drawings as well. So general, very large shapes getting more and more detailed as we go. And as you can see, I just use my liner and a little bit of water for these grays like we did before as well. So, see you next week. Good luck with the assignment.